Richard Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan penthouse, his reflection ghost-like against the glass as he watched the city, 40 floors below, moving in its endless rhythm. While behind him, his 8-year-old daughter Emma sat perfectly still on the white leather couch, her small frame barely making an impression on the cushions as she stared at nothing in particular, her eyes vacant and distant like windows to an empty house. And Richard felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that had taken up permanent residence there 3 years ago, on that rainy November night when their black Mercedes had skidded on the wet highway. The night that changed everything, the night that took Sarah away from them forever, and locked Emma's voice somewhere so deep inside her that no amount of money or specialists could find it again. And now, here they were, father and daughter, living in the same space, but existing in completely different worlds, separated by a silence so thick it felt like a physical wall between them, and Richard turned slightly to study Emma's profile, noting how much she looked like Sarah, with those same delicate features and dark hair that fell in soft waves past her shoulders. But where Sarah's face had always been animated and full of life, Emma's was still as a portrait, frozen in time since that terrible night when she'd screamed for her mother one last time before falling into this impenetrable silence. And the doctors had run every test imaginable, checking her vocal cords, her brain, her nervous system, spending hours in sterile rooms, with expensive machines that beeped in Word and printed out results that all said the same thing. There was nothing physically wrong with Emma Sterling. Her voice had simply retreated so far inside her that it might never find its way out again, and Richard had thrown money at the problem like he did with everything else in his life, hiring the best child psychologists in the country, speech therapists who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, specialists who flew in from Switzerland and Japan with revolutionary techniques that promised breakthroughs, but delivered only more silence. And the penthouse that had once echoed with Emma's laughter and Sarah's singing now felt like a museum. Too quiet, too clean, too empty, despite being filled with priceless art and designer furniture that meant nothing, without the voices that should have filled the spaces between them. And Richard's assistant Margaret kept his schedule packed from dawn until midnight. Meetings and conference calls and business dinners that kept him from having to face the silence at home. Kept him from seeing the accusation in Emma's eyes that maybe if he hadn't insisted on driving that night, if he hadn't been so confident that his expensive car could handle any weather, if he hadn't been arguing with Sarah about missing another school recital for a business trip, maybe things would have been different. And Emma had her own routine now, waking up each morning to the housekeeper's gentle knock, eating breakfast alone while Richard was already at the office, going to her private school, where teachers had learned not to call on her, where other children had stopped trying to include her in their games because she never responded, and after school she would return to the penthouse to sit with her tutors, who patiently worked through lessons without expecting verbal responses, accepting her written answers and nods as enough. And in the evenings, she would draw in her notebooks, filling page after page with pictures that her therapist said were her way of processing trauma, though Richard couldn't bear to look at them too closely because they were always the same. A car in the rain, a figure with long dark hair surrounded by stars, empty speech bubbles floating above stick figures that never had words in them. And sometimes late at night Richard would stand outside Emma's door, listening to the nothing on the other side, remembering how she used to talk in her sleep, little murmurs and giggles that had made him and Sarah smile at each other across the hallway. But now, even her dreams were silent, and the guilt was eating him alive from the inside out. This knowledge that his daughter was trapped somewhere he couldn't reach, that all his success and wealth meant nothing if he couldn't bring back the little girl who used to run to him with stories about her day, who used to sing made-up songs in the bathtub, who used to whisper secrets in his ear with her small hands cupped around his face. And the therapists kept saying that trauma-induced selective mutism could resolve itself with time and patience. but 3 years felt like a lifetime when each day was marked only by the absence of her voice. And Richard had become an expert at reading Emma's subtle signals. The way she would tug at her sleeve when she was anxious. How she would tap her fingers against her leg when she was frustrated. The slight tilt of her head when she was confused. But it wasn't enough, could never be enough to replace actual words, actual conversation. The simple exchange of "I love you" that he desperately wanted to hear again. And the penthouse felt more like a prison with each passing day. Its luxury suffocating in its silence, the space too big for two people who couldn't bridge the gap. Between them and Richard knew, the household staff whispered about them. The tragic millionaire and his mute daughter, living like ghosts in their tower above the city. And he'd overheard Margaret on the phone once saying how heartbreaking it was to see Emma so withdrawn. How the little girl never smiled anymore. Never showed interest in anything except her drawings. And it was true. Emma moved through her days like she was sleepwalking, going through the motions of living without actually being present. Her body there, but her spirit somewhere else entirely. Somewhere Richard couldn't follow, no matter how hard he tried. And he'd read every book about childhood trauma, attended support groups for parents of selective mute children, even tried meditation and prayer, though he'd never been religious. Anything to find a way to reach his daughter, to break through the wall of silence that separated them, but nothing worked. And the worst part was seeing other children with their parents in the lobby of their building, chattering away about school and friends and silly things that didn't matter but meant everything. And Richard would feel Emma's hand tighten in his as they passed, could sense her retreating even further into herself. And he wondered if she remembered what it felt like to speak, if words still formed in her mind, even if they couldn't make it to her lips, if she was screaming inside where no one could hear her. And the irony wasn't lost on him that he could negotiate billion-dollar deals, could command boardrooms and influence markets, but he couldn't find the words to comfort his own daughter. Couldn't fix the one thing that mattered more than all, his achievements combined. And as he stood at the window watching the sun sink behind the Manhattan skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah would have loved, Richard felt the weight of another day ending without progress. Another day of Emma's childhood lost to silence. Another day of failing as a father, and he turned to look at her again, still sitting in the same position she'd been in for the past hour, her notebook open on her lap, but her pencil unmoving. And he wanted to go to her, to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But he'd said those words so many times they'd lost their meaning, and Emma didn't believe in okay anymore, didn't believe in anything except the reality that her mother was gone, and her voice had gone with her, leaving behind only this crushing silence that filled every corner of their lives, pressing down on them like the weight of all those floors below them. And Richard knew something had to change. Something had to break through this pattern they were trapped in, but he didn't know what or how, only that they couldn't continue like this. Two people drowning in silence in a penthouse that had all the trappings of success but none of the warmth of a home. The Saturday morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows differently somehow, catching dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden spirits, as Richard's phone buzzed on the nightstand, with Margaret's name flashing across the screen. But instead of her usual crisp professional greeting, her voice came through rough and apologetic, explaining that she'd caught the flu and wouldn't be able to manage his schedule for the day. And for the first time in months, Richard realized he had absolutely nothing planned. No meetings to hide behind, no conference calls to fill the silence, no business dinners to keep him out late. Just an empty Saturday stretching before him like an accusation. And he padded barefoot to the kitchen, where Emma was already sitting at the marble breakfast table, her small figure dwarfed by the high-backed chair as she hunched over her drawing notebook, her hand moving in careful strokes across the page, while the housekeeper Maria quietly prepared breakfast, and Richard stopped in the doorway, watching his daughter work, noticing how the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair that she'd inherited from Sarah. And he moved closer, actually looking at what Emma was drawing for the first time in weeks, instead of just glancing and moving on, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat because there on the page was a perfect rendering of a playground, complete with swings moving in an implied breeze, a slide that seemed to gleam in penciled sunshine, trees full and green around the edges, and children, so many children, their faces happy and mouths open in what could only be laughter or calls to friends. And in the corner sat a single figure on a bench, alone but watching, and Richard knew instantly that it was Emma herself she'd drawn there, on the outside looking in at a world she no longer felt part of. And something broke inside him at that moment, some wall he'd built around his own heart to keep functioning, and he found himself pulling out the chair next to her, sitting down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment. And Emma looked up at him with those large brown eyes that held too much sadness for an 8-year-old, surprise flickering across her features because Richard never sat with her at breakfast anymore, always grabbing coffee while checking emails, already half out the door before she'd finished her cereal. But today he stayed, and he pointed to her drawing with a gentle finger, careful not to touch the paper and smudge her work, and asked in a voice that came out more emotional than he'd intended, "Would you like to go to the park?" And Emma's eyes widened impossibly, her pencil dropping from suddenly slack fingers to roll across the table. And for a moment Richard thought he'd said something wrong, but then Emma nodded. Not just a simple yes, but an eager, almost desperate movement of her head, and she pushed back from the table so quickly her chair scraped against the floor, running to her room to change out of her pajamas. And Maria looked at Richard with barely concealed shock, because everyone knew Mr. Sterling didn't do spontaneous, didn't do parks, didn't do anything that wasn't scheduled and planned and orchestrated by Margaret. But here he was calling out to Emma that he'd be ready in 10 minutes, and Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a flutter of hope mixed with terrible fear, because he was about to step outside his carefully controlled routine, about to take Emma somewhere without therapists or specialists or anyone to guide them. Just a father and daughter going to the park like normal people, like they used to be before their world shattered. And he threw on jeans and a sweater, clothes he'd forgotten he owned, clothes from before, when Sarah would tease him about his casual Saturday look. And when Emma emerged from her room, she was wearing a purple jacket that Richard remembered buying with Sarah last spring, though it had never been worn, the tags hastily pulled off and discarded on her bedroom floor. And she had her notebook clutched to her chest like armor. But there was something different in her posture, a tiny spark of anticipation that made her stand a little straighter. And Richard realized with a wave of shame that he couldn't remember the last time they'd gone anywhere together that wasn't a doctor's appointment or a therapy session. Couldn't remember the last time he'd suggested something just for fun. And as they rode the elevator down, Emma's hand found his, her small fingers wrapping around his with a grip that felt like trust. And Richard squeezed back gently, a promise, without words, that today would be different. And when they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city hit them with its usual chaos of sounds and smells and movement. But instead of the usual car and driver waiting, Richard turned toward Central Park, and Emma looked up at him with confusion until he said, "Let's walk, it's not far," and her face transformed with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was closer to one than he'd seen in years. And as they walked through the Saturday morning crowds, Richard noticed how Emma's head turned to follow the sounds of other children's voices, how her steps quickened when she heard laughter, how her grip on his hand loosened slightly as if she was allowing herself to relax just a fraction. And Richard felt the weight of realization that in trying to protect Emma, in cushioning her with wealth and professionals and controlled environments, he'd actually been suffocating her, keeping her from the simple, normal experiences that children needed. And as the entrance to Central Park came into view, with its promise of green spaces and playgrounds and life beyond their penthouse prison, Richard saw Emma take a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with what looked like the first real deep breath she'd taken in months, and he knew that whatever happened in the park today, this moment of breaking their routine, of choosing connection over control, was already changing something between them, creating a tiny crack in the wall of silence that had held them both captive for so long. Central Park burst with life around them as Richard and Emma walked along the winding path. The sounds of families laughing and dogs barking, and children calling to each other, creating a symphony of normal life that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. And Emma's eyes darted everywhere at once, taking in the joggers and the picnickers and the street performers, her hands still in Richard's but her body leaning forward slightly as if pulled by invisible strings, toward all this life she'd been separated from for so long. And they passed the playground first, where children, Emma's age, were climbing and swinging and sliding with an abandon that made Emma slow her steps, watching them with an intensity that broke Richard's heart. But when he gently suggested they stop there, she shook her head and tugged him forward, deeper into the park toward the pond, where the path curved and the trees created dappled shadows on the ground. And that's when they heard it, a sound that made Emma stop so abruptly that Richard nearly stumbled, the soft melodic strumming of a guitar floating through the air like a memory. And there on a weathered wooden bench sat an elderly black man, his fingers moving across the strings of an old acoustic guitar with the kind of ease that comes from decades of practice, his eyes closed and his head nodding slightly to the rhythm only he could fully hear. And he was playing jazz. Not the complicated kind that Richard heard in expensive Manhattan clubs, but something simpler, warmer, like sunshine translated into sound. And Emma stood frozen, her notebook pressed against her chest, her eyes fixed on the man with an expression Richard had never seen before. Something between wonder and recognition, though. They'd never been here before, never seen this man, and Richard tried to gently pull Emma along, not wanting to disturb the musician, but Emma's feet seemed rooted to the spot. And then the man opened his eyes, deep brown eyes that crinkled at the corners with years of smiles, and he looked directly at Emma, with no surprise at all, as if he'd been expecting her, and his fingers never stopped moving on the strings as he smiled the kindest smile Richard had ever seen, and said in a voice like warm honey, "Well, hello there, little one," and something in his tone, something in the way he looked at Emma, without pity or discomfort, just simple acknowledgement, made Richard's chest tighten, and Emma took a step forward, then another, drawn to this stranger and his music, like a moth to flame. And Richard wanted to pull her back, his protective instincts screaming that they didn't know this man. But something held him still, maybe the way Emma's shoulders had relaxed for the first time in months, maybe the way the music seemed to wrap around them like a safe cocoon. And the man, who wore a faded brown jacket despite the mild weather, and had a worn fedora placed carefully beside him on the bench with a few dollar bills inside, shifted slightly to make room and patted the bench beside him, never stopping his playing, and he said, "Music lovers always welcome here." And Emma looked back at Richard, asking permission with her eyes, and Richard found himself nodding, though every wealthy parent instinct told him this was wrong, letting his traumatized daughter sit with a stranger in the park. But Emma moved to the bench and sat down carefully, her notebook still clutched to her chest but her body angled toward the guitar, toward the music. And the man glanced at Richard with those knowing eyes and said, "You can sit too, Dad. I don't bite," with a chuckle that somehow made Richard feel foolish for his hesitation, and so he sat on Emma's other side, creating a strange trio on the bench, and the musician continued playing, his fingers finding melodies that seemed to speak without words. And he said to Emma, "You know, you have the look of someone who understands music, really understands it." And Emma's eyes widened, but she remained still, watching his fingers dance across the strings. And the man nodded as if she'd answered and said, "My name's Marcus Williams. Been playing this old guitar for longer than your daddy's been alive, I reckon." And he glanced at Richard with a slight smile before returning his attention to Emma. "And this guitar, she's got stories to tell." "Yes, she does. Stories about children who found their courage, about people who found their way home, about voices that got lost and then found again." And at the word voices, Emma's breath hitched. Barely noticeable, but Marcus seemed to catch it, and he transitioned into a different melody, something slower, sweeter, almost like a lullaby, and he said softly, "This was my granddaughter's favorite song, played it for her every Sunday when she'd come visit. She was just about your age, quiet little thing too, but oh, how she loved this music." And his fingers picked out notes that seemed to hang in the air like questions waiting for answers, and Emma leaned forward slightly, her notebook sliding to her lap, forgotten for the moment as she watched Marcus's weathered hands create magic from wood and strings, and Richard watched his daughter, seeing something awakening in her face, a spark of interest, of connection, that he hadn't seen since before the accident, and Marcus kept talking in that gentle way, not expecting responses, just sharing his music and his presence like gifts that required nothing in return. "You know what my granddaughter used to say? She said the guitar could say things that words couldn't. Said it could speak feelings that got stuck inside." And Emma's hand moved slightly, unconsciously, toward the guitar, stopping just short of touching it, and Marcus noticed. Of course, he noticed, this man who seemed to see everything while looking at nothing, and he said, "Would you like to feel the music? Sometimes feeling it is better than hearing it." And Emma looked at Richard again, and he nodded, though his throat felt tight with emotion he couldn't name. And Emma placed her small hand carefully on the body of the guitar, and Marcus continued playing, and the vibrations traveled through the wood into Emma's palm, and her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, and Marcus just kept playing, creating a moment of perfect understanding between three strangers on a bench, bound together by music, and unspoken grief, and the possibility that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. Marcus's fingers slowed their dance across the strings until they came to rest, the last note hanging in the air between them like a question, and he looked at Emma with those wise brown eyes that seemed 2 whole decades of stories, and said, "You like music, don't you?" And Emma nodded, a quick, eager movement that made her hair bounce around her shoulders, her eyes brighter than Richard had seen them in 3 years, and Marcus smiled. Not the polite smile of strangers, but something deeper, more understanding. And he began playing again, this time a simple, beautiful melody that seemed to pull at something deep in Richard's chest. Notes that climbed and fell like a gentle conversation, and Marcus said softly, his voice blending with the music, "This was my granddaughter's favorite. Called it her sunshine song because she said it made the clouds go away." And his fingers moved with such tenderness across the strings that it was clear this wasn't just a song but a memory, a connection to someone precious. And Emma shifted closer on the bench, her small body drawn to the guitar like it held some secret she desperately needed to know. And Marcus continued, "She was about your age, my Jasmine, quiet as a mouse after her parents passed. Wouldn't say a word for the longest time. Doctors said it was trauma, said she might never speak again." And Richard felt his heart skip because this stranger, this random musician in the park, was describing exactly what they were living through, and Marcus's eyes stayed on Emma as he played, watching her reactions with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. But you know what brought her back? This old guitar, these strings, these vibrations that speak when words can't. And he shifted the guitar slightly, angling it toward Emma, and then he did something that made Richard's breath catch. He held out the guitar toward Emma and said simply, "Want to try?" And Emma froze, her hands pulling back to her chest in an automatic protective gesture, but her eyes stayed locked on the instrument with such longing that it was painful to witness. And Marcus didn't push, didn't insist, just held the guitar there, available, but not demanding, and said, "It's okay, she won't bite. She's friendly. This old guitar, been making friends with quiet children for 40 years, and something in his tone, maybe the way he talked about the guitar like it was alive, like it understood, made Emma slowly, so slowly, reach out one hand, and her fingers barely grazed the smooth wood of the guitar's neck before pulling back again, and Marcus chuckled, softly. That's it. That's how you start. Just like making friends with a shy cat. Little touches until you trust each other. And he placed the guitar gently on his lap in a way that made it accessible to Emma, while still in his control, and he took her small hand in his weathered one, his touch gentle as a whisper, and Richard watched, mesmerized, as this stranger handled his daughter with more care and intuition than all the expensive specialists combined. And Marcus guided Emma's fingers to rest on the strings, not pressing yet, just feeling the tension, the potential for sound, and he said, "Feel that? That's music waiting to happen, just needs someone to let it out." And he placed his own fingers over hers, showing her how to press down, how to create a clear note, and when the sound rang out, pure and true, Emma's eyes widened with something like wonder, and Marcus began to show her simple patterns, her fingers under his, creating music together, and he talked as they played, his voice a soothing rhythm. "That's it, just like that. See how easy it is when you don't think too hard about it, when you just let your feelings move through your fingers." And Emma's concentration was absolute, her entire being focused on the guitar, on the sounds she was helping to create. And Richard noticed that her usual rigid posture had melted away, her shoulders soft, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident, and Marcus moved her fingers to different positions, teaching her a simple melody, 3 notes repeated in different patterns. And he said, "This is the song I taught Jasmine first. Called it the hello song because it's how the guitar says hello to new friends." And Emma was absorbed completely, her fingers beginning to move with less hesitation, finding the notes with Marcus's gentle guidance. And then Marcus did something extraordinary. He began to hum along with the melody, a low, warm sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. And he nodded at Emma encouragingly, not asking her to join, not expecting anything, just showing her that music could come from many places, not just instruments. And the melody they were creating together was simple but beautiful, the kind of tune that stuck in your head and made you feel safe. And other people in the park were starting to notice, some slowing their walks to listen, but Marcus kept his attention entirely on Emma, creating a bubble of safety around them with his presence. And he said, "You know what Jasmine told me once? She said the guitar could hold all the words she couldn't say. Keep them safe until she was ready to take them back." And Emma's fingers stilled for a moment, and she looked up at Marcus with an expression that was part hope, part fear, and he continued, "And one day, she was ready." And all those words came flowing out like they'd just been waiting for the right moment. And he helped Emma play the melody again, this time with more confidence. And Richard could see something shifting in his daughter, some wall beginning to crack, some door beginning to open. And Marcus said, "Music is patient, little one. It waits for us, holds space for us, speaks for us when we can't speak for ourselves." And as Emma's fingers found the notes with increasing sureness, Richard realized he was witnessing something he'd paid thousands of dollars trying to achieve. His daughter connecting with something beyond her trauma, finding a language that didn't require words. And Marcus looked at Richard over Emma's head, his eyes holding a message that said without words, "She's still in there, your little girl. She just needs a different way to come back out." As Marcus guided Emma's fingers across the strings, showing her how to create simple notes that rang out clear and true in the morning air, something shifted in the atmosphere around them, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to happen. And Emma's face had taken on a quality of deep concentration, her pink tongue poking slightly out of the corner of her mouth, the way it used to when she was learning to write her letters. And Marcus kept his movements slow and patient, letting her fingers learn the feel of each string, the pressure needed to make a clean sound, and he began to play a soft accompaniment to her simple notes, weaving a melody around her tentative attempts that made them sound like part of something bigger, something beautiful. And then it happened, so quietly at first that Richard thought he was imagining it. A sound coming from Emma that wasn't quite breathing, but wasn't quite silence either. A tiny vibration in her throat that matched the rhythm of the guitar. And Marcus's hands never faltered, never showed surprise. He just kept playing as if this was exactly what he'd expected, his weathered face calm and encouraging. And the sound grew slightly stronger, becoming recognizable as humming, actual humming. The first deliberate sound Emma had made in 3 years. And Richard's vision blurred with tears he couldn't hold back, his chest so tight he could barely breathe, but he forced himself to stay still, terrified that any movement, any reaction might scare Emma back into silence. And Marcus began to hum along with her, his deep voice creating a harmony with her tiny, fragile sound, showing her it was safe, it was okay, it was wonderful. And Emma's humming grew more confident, following the melody Marcus was playing, rising and falling with the notes. And other people in the park had stopped to watch, sensing something special was happening, but they kept a respectful distance. And Marcus said softly, barely above a whisper, "That's it. That's exactly right. Music speaks when words can't, doesn't it?" And Emma nodded while continuing to hum, her small body swaying slightly with the rhythm, lost in this moment of breakthrough. And Richard pressed his hand to his mouth to stifle a sob, because this was his daughter's voice, changed and uncertain, but unmistakably hers, returning like a bird that had been frightened away, finally deciding it was safe to come home. And Marcus transitioned into a different melody, something that sounded like a lullaby, and Emma's humming followed, adapting to the new tune with an ease that suggested music had been living inside her all along, just waiting for permission to emerge. And Marcus looked at Richard with eyes that understood everything, the years of silence, the desperate attempts to help, the grief that had wrapped around their family like a shroud. And he nodded slightly, as if to say, "Don't react too big, let her find her way." And Richard understood, wiping his tears with the back of his hand, and trying to appear calm, even though his heart was racing. And Emma's humming grew stronger, more melodious, and occasionally, Richard could hear the ghost of actual notes trying to form. Not words yet, but the suggestion that words might be possible, might be waiting just behind this first breakthrough. And Marcus kept playing, creating a safe musical space for Emma to explore these new old sensations of making sound. And he began to tell a story while he played, his voice weaving through the music. "You know, I've been playing in this park for 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of magic happen here, seen people find things they'd lost, seen strangers become friends, seen children remember how to laugh. But music is the biggest magic of all, because it lives in all of us, even when we think it's gone." And Emma's humming continued, becoming almost conversational, responding to the rises and falls in Marcus's story. And Richard noticed her shoulders had completely relaxed, her whole body loose and comfortable in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. And Marcus said, "My Jasmine." When she finally started talking again, "You know what? The first thing she said was, she said, 'Grandpa, the music kept my words safe.' And I knew exactly what she meant, because sometimes our voices need a different path back to us. Need to remember that making sound can be joyful, not just painful." And Emma's humming hitched slightly at this, and for a moment Richard feared she would stop. But instead, she hummed louder, more insistently, as if testing the limits of what she could do. And Marcus encouraged her with his playing, adding little flourishes that made her humming sound like part of a professional performance. And people passing by were dropping money into Marcus's hat, thinking they were watching a rehearsed act, not knowing they were witnessing a child finding her voice. After 3 years of silence, and Marcus said to Emma, "You're a natural little one. The guitar really likes you. Can you feel how happy she is to sing with you?" And Emma nodded eagerly, her humming taking on an almost laugh-like quality. And Richard realized that this wasn't just about Emma making sound again. It was about her remembering that she could create something beautiful, that she had power over something in her life when so much had been taken from her control. And Marcus played a final chord, letting it ring out, while Emma's humming gradually faded with it. And in the silence that followed, a silence that felt different from all the silences of the past 3 years because this one was chosen, not forced. Emma looked at Marcus with shining eyes, and then at Richard, and though she didn't speak, her face said everything. Said, "Did you hear me? I made sound. I exist. I'm still here." And Richard reached out slowly and touched her shoulder, just a gentle pressure that said, "I heard you. Baby, I heard you." And Marcus smiled his warm, knowing smile and said, "That's just the beginning, little one. Your voice is in there. Just needed to remember the way out, and now it's found the first door." Marcus set the guitar carefully beside him on the bench, his weathered hands resting on his knees as he looked at Emma with those deep, understanding eyes that seemed to hold entire lifetimes of stories. And Emma stayed close to him, her small body still vibrating with the achievement of making sound. Her first sound in 3 long years, and Marcus began to speak in that gentle, rumbling voice that made everything he said feel like a warm blanket on a cold day. "You know, I should tell you both something. I'm not just an old man who plays guitar in the park, though I am that too." And he chuckled softly, the sound mixing with the distant noise of children playing and birds singing. "For 40 years, I was a music therapist at Mount Sinai Hospital. Worked with children who'd been through things no child should have to endure. Car accidents, house fires, violence, losses that broke something inside them." And Richard felt his breath catch because this wasn't coincidence. This was something else, something that felt like fate or providence or maybe just the universe, finally offering them a lifeline. And Marcus continued, his eyes now focused on something distant, something painful. "Started that work because of my own granddaughter, Jasmine. I mentioned her before, but what I didn't tell you was the whole story." And he paused, his fingers unconsciously moving, as if playing an invisible guitar. 8 years ago, Jasmine's parents, my son David, and his wife Marie, they were coming home from her school play. Jasmine had been a tree in the spring production, proudest tree you ever saw, and his smile was sad now, tinged with a grief that Richard recognized intimately. Drunk driver ran a red light, hit them head on. David and Marie died instantly. But Jasmine, she survived. Physically, she was barely hurt. A miracle, the doctors said, but something inside her just shut down, locked itself away, where nobody could reach it, and Emma had gone very still. Her eyes fixed on Marcus, with an intensity that Richard had never seen before, as if she was recognizing her own story in his words. And Marcus continued, 6 years, old and completely silent, wouldn't speak, wouldn't cry, wouldn't make any sound at all, just sat there looking at the world like she was watching it through glass, like she wasn't really part of it anymore. And his voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. The doctors tried everything, therapy, medications, treatments that cost more money than I had, but nothing worked, and I was losing her, watching this bright, chattering little girl disappear into silence. And he looked at Emma then, really looked at her, just like you, little one. Same lost look in the eyes, same way of holding yourself like you're afraid you might break if you move. To suddenly, and Emma's hand moved unconsciously toward Marcus, not quite touching, but reaching. And Marcus said, "Then one day, I was sitting in my apartment, playing my old guitar, the same one David learned on when he was a boy, just playing to keep myself from going crazy with grief. And Jasmine came and sat next to me. Didn't say anything, of course, but she put her hand on the guitar, feeling the vibrations, and something in her face changed, just a tiny bit, but I saw it." And Richard was leaning forward now, completely absorbed in this story that was both different and exactly the same as their own. And Marcus picked up the guitar again, his fingers finding soft, contemplative notes. "So I started playing for her every day, simple songs at first. lullabies her mother used to sing, and slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice it happening, she started to respond, first just swaying a little, then tapping her foot. Then one day, 4 months after the accident, she hummed, and he looked at Emma with such tenderness, just like you did today, just a tiny sound, but it was everything. It was proof she was still in there, still fighting to find her way back, and Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears. And Richard saw his daughter truly seeing someone else for the first time in 3 years, connecting with another human being who understood her pain, and Marcus said, took another 2 months before she spoke, and you know what her first words were? She said, "The music holds the hurt, so I don't have to carry it all." And he shook his head in wonder. 8 years old, and she understood something that most adults never figure out. That sometimes we need something else to help us carry our pain, something beautiful that can transform it into something bearable. And he looked at Richard then. That's when I knew what I was supposed to do with my life. Help other children find their voices again through music, and I did, for 40 years, until I retired last year, but I still come here, play in the park. Because you never know when someone might need what this old guitar can offer. And he turned back to Emma. And today, when I saw you walking with your daddy, something told me to play Jasmine's song, the Sunshine Song, and then you stopped. And I just knew you were one of the quiet ones, one of the ones holding too much pain to speak. And Emma was trembling slightly now, overwhelmed by being seen, being understood. And Marcus said gently, Jasmine's 17 now, wants to be a music therapist like her old grandpa, says she wants to help other children the way music helped her, and she still comes to the park with me sometimes, plays guitar for the little ones who stop to listen, and he smiled. She'd like you, I think. She has a soft spot for the quiet ones, says they're the ones who have the most to say once they find their voices again. And Richard found his voice finally, rough with emotion. Is that true? Does it really come back? And Marcus looked at him with infinite compassion. Every child is different. Every journey back is unique. But I've never met a child who didn't have words inside them. Sometimes they just need a different door to come through. And music. He patted the guitar. Music is one of the oldest doors humans have. It was here before language. It'll be here after. It speaks to parts of us that words can't reach. And he stood up slowly, his joints creaking slightly. I'm here every Saturday, same bench, same time, been my routine since I retired. Helps me feel useful, connected. And he looked at Emma. You're welcome to come listen anytime, or play, or just sit. No pressure, no expectations. Just music and understanding. And Emma stood up too, clutching her notebook, and she did something that stunned Richard. She reached out and touched Marcus's hand, just for a second, a gesture of connection, of gratitude, of recognition. And Marcus squeezed her hand gently, before letting go. You're going to be okay, little one. The path back is there. You just needed someone to show you the first steps. Richard felt the tears streaming down his face, before he even realized he was crying. Hot trails of moisture that he'd held back for 3 years, suddenly breaking free like a dam had burst inside him. And he didn't try to wipe them away, didn't try to maintain the composed facade of the successful businessman he'd hidden behind for so long. Because in this moment, sitting on a park bench, with his silent daughter and a stranger who understood their pain, all his carefully constructed walls were crumbling. And Marcus was watching him with those knowing eyes, not with judgment, but with the compassion of someone who had walked this path before, who knew the weight of carrying a child's pain on top of your own. And Richard heard himself speaking, words tumbling out that he'd never said to anyone, not to the therapists, not to his business partners, not even to himself in the dark hours of the night. I've been doing it all wrong, haven't I? And his voice cracked like a teenager's, raw and exposed. I thought if I threw enough money at the problem, hired enough specialists, controlled enough variables, I could fix her, fix us. But I've just been running away, haven't I? Hiding behind appointments and schedules and experts because I couldn't face the fact that I don't know how to reach my own daughter. And Emma was looking at him with wide eyes, seeing her father cry for the first time since the funeral, seeing him not as the man who had all the answers, but as someone just as lost as she was. And Marcus said quietly, "You're both grieving, but you've been grieving apart. Each in your own silence, your own isolation." And the words hit Richard like a physical blow because they were so obviously true, so painfully accurate. And he thought about all the nights he'd stayed late at the office to avoid the silent penthouse. All the mornings he'd left before Emma woke up because he couldn't bear to see the emptiness in her eyes. All the times he'd handed her over to another specialist instead of sitting with her himself. And Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "Children don't need to be fixed, Mr. Sterling. They need to be seen, heard, felt, even when they can't speak, especially when they can't speak." And Richard watched as Emma moved closer to him on the bench, not quite touching but reducing the distance between them. And Marcus said, "You've both been trapped in the same pain but experiencing it alone. Like two people drowning in the same ocean but too far apart to hold on to each other." And Richard felt something shift in his chest, a understanding dawning that all his wealth, all his resources, all his careful planning had actually been keeping them apart, creating barriers instead of bridges. And he looked at Emma, really. Looked at her, not as a problem to be solved, but as a little girl who had lost her mother and her voice in one terrible night, and had been trying to find her way back ever since. And Marcus picked up the guitar again, playing something soft and contemplative. "You know what Jasmine taught me? She taught me that healing isn't about going back to who we were before. It's about finding who we can be after. And that journey, it can't be rushed, can't be bought, can't be scheduled. It has to be walked, step by step, together." And Emma was watching her father's tears with a mixture of fear and fascination. And then she did something that made Richard's breath catch. She reached into her notebook and pulled out a drawing, one she must have done recently, and handed it to him with shaking hands. And Richard looked at it and felt his heart shatter all over again, because it was a picture of three figures. Clearly him, Emma, and Sarah, but while Sarah was drawn in, light ethereal strokes like a memory or a ghost, Richard and Emma were drawn on opposite sides of the page, with a vast empty space between them, both reaching toward Sarah, but not toward each other. And Richard understood what his daughter had been trying to tell him through her art, that they were both alone in their grief, both reaching for someone who couldn't reach back while ignoring the one person who could. And Marcus saw the drawing, too, and nodded slowly. Children see truth more clearly than adults sometimes. They haven't learned to lie to themselves yet. And Richard felt years of executive training, of emotional control, of professional distance dissolving as he turned to Emma and said through his tears, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I left you alone in this. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself. I couldn't. I can't." And his voice broke completely. "I miss her too. I miss her so much. And I see her in you every day, and it hurts, but it's also the most beautiful pain because you're here. You're still here, and I've been wasting that gift. Wasting time we could have been healing together." And Emma's own tears were falling now. Silent still, but present, acknowledging, and Marcus played on, creating a musical backdrop for this moment of breakthrough. And he said softly, "The first step to helping her find her voice is admitting you've lost yours too. Mr. Sterling, you can't lead someone out of the darkness if you won't admit you're in it yourself." And Richard reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and pulled Emma against him, and she came willingly, collapsing into his chest like she'd been waiting 3 years for this invitation. And they cried together, father and daughter, while Marcus played his guitar and the park moved around them, joggers passing, children laughing, life continuing, in all its messy, beautiful complexity. And Richard felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. The understanding that healing wouldn't come from outside experts or expensive treatments, but from this, from connection, from admitting brokenness, from choosing to walk through the darkness together instead of alone. And Marcus looked at them with satisfaction, like a gardener who had just planted seeds that would take time to grow, but would surely bloom. And he said, "Now you're ready to really begin. Now you're ready to help each other find your voices again." And Richard held Emma tighter, feeling her small heart beating against his chest, feeling her tears soaking through his shirt, feeling the first real connection they'd had since that night when their world shattered. And he understood that Marcus had given them something more valuable than all the therapy money could buy. He'd given them permission to be broken together, to heal together, to find their way back to each other through the shared language of grief and love. And now, music. Marcus began teaching them both a simple song, positioning the guitar so both Richard and Emma could reach it. And Richard felt awkward, his large hands clumsy next to Emma's small ones, but Marcus was patient, showing them how to work together, Richard holding the neck of the guitar while Emma strummed, and they fumbled at first, creating sounds that were more noise than music. But Marcus just smiled and said, "Every symphony starts with noise. That's how you know something new is being born." And slowly, through repetition and gentle guidance, they began to find a rhythm together, father and daughter, creating something that wasn't perfect but was theirs. And Emma's concentration was absolute, her tongue poking out again as she focused on getting the strumming pattern right. And Richard watched her face, seeing joy creeping back into her features like sunrise after the longest night. And then Marcus began to hum along, that deep, resonant sound that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with warmth. And Emma joined him again, her humming stronger now, more confident. And they were all making music together, 3 generations united by melody. And that's when it happened, as naturally as breathing, as simply as a door opening that had been stuck for too long. Emma spoke, just one word, barely a whisper, but clear and unmistakable. "Mama," and the world seemed to stop, even the sounds of the park fading away, as that single word hung in the air like a miracle. And Richard's hands froze on the guitar. But Marcus kept playing, didn't make a big reaction that might frighten Emma back into silence. And he said in the most casual, gentle voice, "She loved music, didn't she?" As if Emma speaking was the most normal thing in the world. And Emma nodded, and then, like a dam with the first crack spreading, more words came, rusty and uncertain, like machinery that hadn't been used in too long starting up again. She sang, and Richard couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only listen as his daughter's voice, different than he remembered, older, touched by grief, but unmistakably hers, continued. She sang, in the car, and Marcus kept playing, creating a safe musical foundation for these fragile words to land on. And he said, "Tell me about her singing." And Emma's face crumpled slightly, but she didn't retreat into silence. Instead, she said, "Pretty, ... Her voice was ... pretty, like birds, and each word seemed to cost her enormous effort, like she was pulling them up from some deep place where they'd been buried. But they were coming, and Richard found his own voice, barely managing to say, "She did, baby. She sang beautifully, just like you used to." And Emma looked at him with those brown eyes that were so like Sarah's, and said, "I can single quotes remember, my songs." And the pain in her voice was devastating. This child who had lost not just her mother, but all the songs they'd shared. And Marcus said, "Songs don't really leave us. They just hide sometimes when we're too sad to sing them, but they're patient. They wait for us." And he played a few notes of a lullaby that Richard recognized, something universal that every parent knew. And Emma's eyes widened with recognition, and she whispered, "Twinkle." Mama sang, "Twinkle," and Marcus nodded and began playing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" slowly, reverently, like it was a sacred hymn. And Emma's voice joined in, not singing yet, but speaking the words, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," and Richard felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time, watching his daughter reclaim her voice word by word, note by note, and she continued, "How I wonder what you are," and her voice grew slightly stronger with each word, like a muscle remembering how to work, up above the world so high, and now she was almost sing-speaking, finding a rhythm, like a diamond in the sky, and tears were streaming down all their faces. Even Marcus, who had seen this kind of breakthrough before, but clearly never took it for granted, and Emma kept going, her voice gaining strength and melody. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are," and when she finished, she looked at Richard and said the words he'd been desperate to hear for 3 years, words that seemed impossible just an hour ago. "Daddy, I missed you," and Richard pulled her close, sobbing openly now, and managed to say, "I missed you too, baby. I've been right here, but I missed you too." And Emma said, her voice still rough and uncertain, but definitely there, definitely real, "I was scared. If I talked, Mama would be really gone." And the logic of it, the heartbreaking child logic that had kept her silent, made perfect sense and no sense at all. And Marcus said softly, "But she's not gone, is she? She's in the songs, in the memories, in the love you still carry." And Emma nodded against Richard's chest and said, "The music, it makes her feel close." And Richard understood then what Marcus had known all along, that Emma hadn't lost her voice. She'd hidden it, protected it, kept it safe with her memories of her mother, afraid that using it would mean accepting the loss. And Marcus said, "Your mama would be so proud to hear you sing again, to hear you speak again. She wouldn't want you to be silent." And Emma pulled back slightly to look at Marcus and asked, her voice small but clear, "Does Jasmine still remember her parents?" And Marcus smiled sadly and said, "Every day. But now she remembers them with joy mixed in with the sadness. She remembers them when she plays music, when she helps other children, when she laughs. They're part of her, but they don't stop her from living." And Emma seemed to consider this, then said, I want to remember Mama with joy," and the determination in her young voice was heartbreaking and inspiring. And Richard said, "We'll remember her together, with joy and sadness, and everything in between." And Emma nodded, and then asked Marcus, "Will you teach me more songs?" And Marcus smiled his warm, crinkly smile, and said, "Every Saturday, if you'd like. Same bench, same time." And Emma looked at Richard, asking permission, with eyes that were alive again, present again. And Richard nodded through his tears, and Emma turned back to Marcus and said, her voice stronger now, more confident, "Yes, please. I want to learn all the songs." And in that moment, sitting on a park bench with tears on their faces and hope in their hearts, they weren't millionaire and daughter, weren't tragedy victims, weren't a family broken by loss. They were just 3 people connected by music and understanding, by the knowledge that voices could be lost and found again, that healing was possible, that sometimes the most profound changes come from the simplest moments of human connection. Every Saturday, after that, became sacred in a way that Richard's business meetings had never been, marked on his calendar in bold letters that Margaret learned meant absolutely unmovable, no matter what crisis arose at the company, no matter what deal was on the table, because Saturdays were for the park, for Marcus, for Emma finding her way back to herself one song at a time. And that first week between encounters had been tentative. Emma speaking in short bursts like she was testing if her voice still worked. Single words at breakfast, short phrases at bedtime. But by Thursday, she had asked Richard a complete question about whether Marcus would really be there. And Richard had promised with everything in him that he would be. And when Saturday came, they walked to the park hand in hand. Emma carrying a small notebook where she'd been writing down things she wanted to tell Marcus, words she wanted to try. And there he was, same bench, same worn guitar, same warm smile, as reliable as sunrise, and Emma had run the last few steps, actually run. Something she hadn't done in years. And Marcus greeted her like she was his own granddaughter returning home. And the lessons began. But they were more than lessons. They were therapy sessions disguised as jam sessions. Conversations wrapped in melodies, and slowly, through the weeks that turned into months, Emma's voice grew stronger, more confident. And she began to talk about the accident, about that night, about the fear that had locked her voice away, and Marcus never pushed, never demanded more than she could give, just created space with his music for her to fill with whatever words wanted to come, and Richard learned to play too, his fingers becoming less clumsy on the strings, and more importantly, he learned to listen, really listen. Not as CEO Richard Sterling, who had solutions for everything, but as a father who understood that sometimes the best thing he could do was simply be present. And one Saturday, about 2 months in, a teenage girl appeared beside Marcus, tall and graceful with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years, and Marcus introduced her as Jasmine, and Emma had been shy at first, intimidated by this older girl. But Jasmine had sat down on the grass in front of the bench and said, "Grandpa told me about you, said you're brave like I was." And Emma had whispered, "I'm not brave." And Jasmine had smiled and said, "Yes, you are. Every word you speak is brave. I remember how hard it was." And she pulled out her own guitar, smaller than Marcus's, painted with butterflies and stars, and she played a song she'd written about finding her voice again. And Emma watched, with wonder, as this girl who had been through the same darkness showed her what was possible on the other side. And from then on, Jasmine joined them sometimes, teaching Emma songs that younger people knew, pop songs and Disney melodies that made Emma laugh. A sound that Richard had feared was lost forever, and the four of them became an unlikely family, of sorts, bonded not by blood but by understanding, by shared experience, by music that spoke what words couldn't always express. And Emma began to tell Marcus and Jasmine things she couldn't tell Richard directly, about how she blamed herself for distracting her parents that night, about how she thought if she'd been quiet in the car maybe her mother would still be alive. And Marcus had taken her small hands in his weathered ones, and said with absolute certainty, "Child, accidents aren't caused by little girls being happy. They're caused by circumstances beyond our control, and your mama would never want you to carry that weight." And Richard learned about his daughter through these overheard confessions, understanding finally the depth of guilt she'd been carrying, and he found his own voice to tell her, over and over, that it wasn't her fault, would never be her fault, that her mother had loved hearing her voice in the car, had loved her chatter and songs and stories. And Emma began to believe him, slowly, incrementally, like trust being rebuilt, brick by brick. And she started asking about Sarah, wanting to hear stories about her mother, and Richard found that talking about Sarah got easier with practice. The pain still there, but softer somehow, mixed with gratitude for the time they'd had. And Marcus shared his own stories about David and Marie, showing them that grief could coexist with joy, that remembering didn't have to mean only pain. And one Saturday Emma brought her school notebook and shyly told them she'd been talking in class, answering questions, even made a friend named Lucy who liked to draw. And Richard had to turn away to hide his tears, because this was his daughter, returning to the world, not all at once, but in small, brave steps. And Marcus said, "See, your voice was just waiting for you to be ready." And Emma asked if she could learn the song Marcus had been playing when they first met, the Sunshine Song, Jasmine's song, and Marcus taught it to her with infinite patience, and when she could play it through without mistakes, she said, "I want to play it for Mama." And they went together, all four of them, to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. And Emma played the Sunshine Song on Marcus's guitar, while Jasmine hummed harmony, and Richard held her shoulders, and Marcus stood like a guardian angel. And when she finished, Emma said clearly, "I love you, Mama. I'm okay now. I'm going to be okay." And Richard knew it was true. not because the pain was gone, but because they'd learned to carry it together, learned to transform it through music and connection, and the simple act of showing up every Saturday. And Marcus looked at them with pride and said, "This is how we heal, not in great leaps, but in small steps, not alone but together, not in silence, but in song." And Emma hugged him then, fierce and tight, this man who had started as a stranger, but had become family, who had given them back to each other when they'd been lost. And she said, "Thank you for finding me." And Marcus hugged her back and said, "Child, you were never lost. You were just taking the long way home." And Richard understood that sometimes the most profound healings come not from medical intervention or professional treatment, but from human connection. From someone who sees your pain and says, "I understand. I've been there. Let me sit with you while you find your way through."